Hello, everyone. It's really glad to have Dr. Angharad Weeks to come to visit us here in person. It's great always to have an in-person speaker. And Dr. Weeks got her PhD from the Space Lab at UCL just last year. And now she's a postdoc researcher at UCID. She's expert in actually all the field, most of the field we have in the group, just a drawing adventure of stars and planets. So this is actually a very interesting talk for the entire group. And feel free to take over when you're ready.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Chelsea, and thanks everyone for having me this week. It's been really great to visit in person. I've really enjoyed it so far. Yeah, so I'm Angharad. I'm a postdoc at UCID. I work in the Asteroseismology group there. But my research broadly kind of spans stars and planets, like Chelsea said. So today my talk is broadly titled Exoplanets over Galactic Timescales. But I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about stars and why it's really important that we understand the properties of stars so that we can understand the properties of planets. So just to start from the basics, if you have we measure the radii of planets using the transit method. This is an indirect way of measuring radius. We do this by measuring the transit depth, and this kind of tells us about the ratio of the planet to the stellar radius. And so if you understand your stellar radius pretty well, you can understand your planet radius pretty well. And you see a transit dip that looks, like it should for this kind of planet, you might think you found an Earth-like planet, which is exciting. This is an artist's rendition of Kepler 22b, which is something along those lines. But actually, if you've misunderstood your stellar radius slightly and your star's actually a bit bigger than you thought when you initially made this measurement, what you might actually be looking at is a slightly different type of planet. Sub-Neptunes are just as interesting in my opinion, but it's still good to know exactly what you're looking at. So stellar properties are really important in exoplanet science. This obviously also applies for stellar masses and planet masses when we use the radial velocity method, and a bunch of other methods as well. So it's really important on an individual basis that we understand stars so that we can measure planets. But as we all know, we're finding planets across the whole galaxy now, especially with missions like TESS that are doing all sky surveys. And here I'm just plotting the exoplanet host stars in the galactic coordinates. And you can see where a lot of them cluster. Obviously, the Kepler field here, this huge blob. Kepler found thousands of exoplanets, but even the K2 field along the ecliptic here, this S-like curve, and TESS now is finding stars across the whole sky, and some of them are overlapping with some interesting features like stellar clusters. But what I'm trying to paint with this sort of picture is to understand the broad population of planets that we have. It's like 6,000 or close to 7,000 now. I don't keep track as much as I used to when I was a PhD student, so I check it quite often. But we really need to understand, like, broadly the demographics of the host stars as well to try and make these comparisons. And the reason we want to do this is because we want to try and understand a little bit more about some of the broader questions about how exoplanets formed, how they came to be, how they evolve over their lifetime, and also about what their atmospheres might be like. And these are all sort of the directions that exoplanet science is going in now that we've nailed down detection a little bit more. Obviously, there's lots of detection coming up and lots of detection in the future, but these are some of the science sort of goals that we're going to talk about a little bit in this presentation. And the reason we want to understand this is because many people will be familiar with a diagram like this, but we usually look at populations of exoplanets in the period mass sort of regime. So orbital period, how far away basically from the host star these planets are on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the planet mass. And you can see I've just plotted a couple of the solar system planets on this plot: Jupiter, Venus, and Earth. And you can see Jupiter's kind of off the scale here, and the outer planets would be way off this scale. And I've just plotted the first exoplanet that was found around a solar type star, which is 51 b. And if you compare this to a population of exoplanets that we found, this isn't all of them, but like some of the brighter ones in the sample that I'm going to be talking about today. The thing that motivates us to try and understand the formation and evolution and atmospheres is because exoplanets are not very similar to solar system planets. They're not lying in the same region of parameter space that maybe we expected when we started to find them. 20, 25 years ago. And so up in the top left corner, you've got the hot Jupiters that are very close to their host stars, massive. In the bottom left corner, you've got some super Earths and sub Neptunes, which I'll talk about a bit more soon. And you've got some colder planets over in the top right as well that we call the cold Jupiters. If you're not familiar with the terms, that's kind of how we divide them up, although people like to argue about the definitions there. And what I set about doing during my PhD is homogenizing the host star parameters of a large sample of these exoplanets. And the reason we wanted to do this is because on an individual basis, actually, before Gaia, host star properties were kind of determined on an ad hoc basis, paper by paper. People would do things sometimes pretty precisely, using spectroscopy and fitting to models and getting the masses and things like that. But it was kind of all done slightly differently depending on which team you're working in or which data you have available for your host star. And so Gaia DR3 was really amazing. It came out in the first year or second year of my PhD, and it enabled us to get homogeneous astrometry, photometry, and spectroscopy for the bright host stars in an sample. And so I used these and fed them into a code called BASTA, which stands for the Bayesian Stellar Algorithm. And this enables us to use the parallax and the photometry to fit for the distance and the luminosity, and then use the spectroscopic parameters to refine the physical parameters of the star in a cohesive Bayesian way that's sampled correctly. And we use the GASTEC stellar models, grids of these stellar models to do this. We had our collaborators in Aarhus make really, really finely sampled GASTEC grids. We were absolutely getting as much precision as we possibly could. Doing this all homogeneously with Gaia, all from space-based data, which was really exciting. And among other things, what we were able to get out of this formalism is homogeneous masses, radii, distances, and ages of host stars. And so first of all, like I kind of touched upon, using the mass and the radius of these host stars, we can redefine the planet parameters using semi-amplitude for planet masses from radial velocity, and using the radius ratio from the transit method to recalculate the radii. And this gives us a sort of a semi-homogeneous set of planet parameters as well, using our homogeneous stellar parameters. So that's another step that was enabling us to make this a bit more of a cohesive sample that we could do some statistics with. From the mass and the radius, for most planets, you can at least get a bulk density. For planets with atmospheres, it's a bit harder to use this density to determine the composition. But for small rocky planets, which I'll touch on in a bit, you can maybe do this a little bit more. And what it sort of evolved into is me asking the question, can we link any of these properties to the stellar ages? And the reason I wanted to do this is because, before Gaia, we didn't have parallaxes for all of these stars. We didn't have homogeneous metallicities for all of these stars. And so it wasn't really possible to consider ages, at least on a homogeneous basis. Ages are pretty challenging stellar parameters to determine in the first place. And if you don't have homogeneous parameters, it's really hard to make any inferences. But this is what I set about doing. And first of all, I want to consider how age can tell us about formation mechanisms for exoplanet host stars. So I'm going to focus here on rocky planets. Some of you might have heard me talk a little bit about this if you're at Newcastle, so it'll be a refresher if you already know about it. But in this paper that I'm kind of talking about the results of, we're considering the rocky planets that are below the radius value. For those of you not in exoplanet science and not familiar with that term, essentially what that means is we think that these planets don't have a large hydrogen helium atmosphere. So if they do have an atmosphere, it's very small and probably not detectable just with radius and mass measurements. So you can essentially, in a basic sense, think of them as bare rocks. And here's a really simple two-layer diagram of how we think these exoplanets kind of look. So they've got an iron core, a more dense core, and then a mantle surrounding it that's slightly less dense. And so for these stars that were hosting these types of planets, we recalculated all the masses and radii and ages, and fed that through, recalculated the planet parameters too. There's not loads of rocky planets that have both mass and radius, but we used all of the ones that we could. And here I'm just plotting the results from this paper from 2020. It got published eventually in 2025. On the x-axis here is the planet mass, And then on the y-axis is the radius. So this is a slightly different parameter space to the previous plot I showed you. But this is kind of how we start to consider planet compositions. This is one of the parameter spaces that we do that in. I'm going to plot the planets here. And you can see that they are color-coded by these homogeneous ages that we got from the study. And something really interesting popped out when we were able to look at the planets in this way. You might be able to see it by eye. At the very least, what you can kind of see is above this orange line that sort of is in the middle of these two other lines, points above that look like they have older ages. Points below that line look like they have younger ages. And these are actually compositional tracks from a few papers that I've listed down below. The top compositional track describes planets that are basically pure rock, so they don't really have a dense core at all in that sort of model. The bottom line is like a pure iron, like fully core-based planet, and then in the middle is an Earth-like model, which is kind of in between. And you can see that planets that seem to be more dense than the Earth, so underneath that line, look like they orbit around stars that are younger than the planets that are above that line. And so we interpreted this as a change in the iron composition or the density or the core mass fraction. There's a few ways to think about it, but they all kind of describe the same thing. The composition of these exoplanets seems to vary with age. Now, when you first think about age in an exoplanet context, the immediate thing that you think about is some kind of evolution over time. So the planet is changing over time. But that's actually not what we think is happening here, especially because we don't think that rock can really compress or expand in this noticeable way over giga-year timescales. So what we think is actually happening is at the beginning of the formation of the galaxy, all the stars, 10 billion years ago, 11 billion years ago, something like that, had very different compositions to the stars that were born much more recently. So they had much less iron and they were much more abundant in alpha elements. And what this might mean, this was our interpretation, and it agrees with some follow-up studies as well, is that there wasn't as much iron in the disks of the host stars that were forming these planets, so they couldn't produce large iron cores. But more recently, stars are more enriched by nuclear synthesis over the timescale of the galaxy. And so we think that maybe the cores are bigger, or there's a larger core mass fraction. There's more dense stars, planets that are able to form around these younger stars. And so this is the paper title. We think that we found this link between rock and planet composition and stellar age for the first time. And people are also following this up by trying to measure very precisely the different elemental abundances of these host stars. So not just the standard metallicity FeOH, but we couldn't really see a very strong trend with FeOH. We tried to compare to a lot of other stellar parameters to see what was going on. But if you measure individual alpha abundances, you can maybe convince yourself that there is evidence of the chemistry of the host star influencing these rocky planet compositions, which I think is really exciting. So these are some papers that you can check out if you're interested in kind of reading about it further. And yeah, we think this result is a result of planet formation. But now I want to move on and talk about a test case, I suppose, where we can think about the evolution of the planet over time. So over giga-year timescales, how does the planet evolve and change? So I said that rocky planets probably can't change over time in and of themselves. But if we think about a different area of the parameter space, so we just went down to the rocky planets down in the bottom left here, and now we're traveling up. This is on a log scale, so actually these planets are vastly different to the rocky planets that I just talked about. Many of them are more massive than Jupiter and radially larger. These are the hot Jupiters. They orbit around their host stars at ridiculously short periods, and we're all kind of desensitized to this because we deal with them all the time. But the periods that these planets are orbiting around their host stars are really quite remarkably short. And hot Jupiters were some of the first planets that we were able to discover because they're so large, so the influence on their host star is larger. And since basically the beginning of exoplanet science, we've been faced with this problem. Hot Jupiters are larger than any planet formation models can actually predict. So if you think about what hot Jupiters are made of, we think that there's some kind of like solid core that's maybe similar to what those solid planets that I just showed you look like, but then they have an enormous hydrogen, helium, or other light element atmosphere. And when you keep adding mass to a compressible atmosphere, at some point it should stop growing, just because of the compressibility of the materials in the atmosphere, right? It should stop growing and just start getting denser instead. And people have made very detailed models about when this should happen. And it's between 1.05 and 1.2 Jupiter radii. But we find lots of planets, lots of hot Jupiter planets that are much larger than this 1.2 or there or thereabouts kind of value. And this has puzzled exoplanet scientists for, I don't know, like 30 years now, maybe it's coming on. Like we haven't been able to fully figure out what's going on. Obviously, lots of people have tried, lots of very clever theoreticians have tried. We've tried to look at what stellar parameters this scales with, like what might be causing this, how this relates to the planet mass. And the key thing that we've been able to find out observationally, again here I'm showing you a mass radius diagram, but this is in Jupiter scale, so different masses, different radii. I've just highlighted the area where we think these planets are inflated where they should be. So above this 1.1-ish value is where planets are inflated. This is the population of hot Jupiters. You can see that many of them are in fact too large. And I don't know if the color scheme is as clear on the screen, but I've color coded these by the equilibrium temperature, which is essentially a proxy for the flux in the period. So you can see that the more inflated planets are hotter, so they're closer to their host stars, so they're being radiated and they've expanded. So generally we accept that this is one of the causes of the inflation. And some of the theoretical explanations, one of them is, well, there are many different theoretical explanations, but they kind of fall into two camps. And that's what I'm going to briefly tell you about in a simplified way. So the first one is delayed cooling. So some of you may know that when planets form, we think that they're, when they're really hot and luminous, when they first form in the first like few million years, short time scales, they're a bit puffier and more expanded because they're so hot, and then they cool down and they stabilize and they contract. And what delayed cooling kind of proposes is that this cooling down is delayed. It's kind of in the name. So there is some process inside the planet or something acting that is causing this cooling to take longer than we think it should. Whatever those processes are kind of debated. You should read the literature if you're really interested in those, if you don't know about them. And the second is interior heating. That's generally what it's called. It's a slightly misleading name, I personally think, because it's really referring to the planet being heated, the interior of the planet, or like the interior layers of the planet being heated probably by the host star. So like maybe it should be called something like external heating. I'm not going to die on that hill though. Essentially, yeah. So interior heating kind of proposes that cooling happens normally, so we shouldn't be observing these inflated radii. But over time, for some reason, the host star is causing the planet to inflate because of its radiation. It's causing this inflation, and how these link to age is something that people have started to think about in the last few years. And a lot of this thinking, I should preface, is inspired by a paper by Daniel Thorngren and Jonathan Courtney, who were thinking about how we can better test which of these might be happening by looking at the host star properties. And delayed cooling, how that would, in a simplified way, present itself. If we were looking at the age of all the hot Jupiters in the radius, so they're on the X and Y axis, what we might expect in a really simplified, like cartoon model, is that we'd see more inflated hot Jupiters at younger ages because they haven't quite finished cooling down yet, and then as they age, they cool down. So that's how we can use the demographics to look at that. But if internal heating is acting, we think that over the main sequence age of the star, the radius increases, because it's being heated by the host star over time. So we don't think that the younger systems would be necessarily more inflated. We think they inflate over time. So we see that in older systems. And you notice that I put main sequence age on the x-axis here, and that's because we have to think about this slightly differently when we're thinking about inflation over the main sequence lifetime, because just the pure age doesn't necessarily reflect the point at which the star is in its long-term evolution. And so this actually introduced a really interesting way to think about how we define age when we're thinking about exoplanet host-star properties as well. And this is a sort of a preliminary plot from this paper. It was the third paper from my PhD that I still haven't submitted, so I keep saying I'm going to finish it, work on it, but I'm still working on the interpretation because I think, you know, there's no like clear picture of what's happening. But here I am showing you the main result, which is the radius on the y-axis, and then the sort of the age divided by the main sequence age on the x-axis. And so what this x-axis means is that at 1, the star is turning off the main sequence. So it's evolving, it's expanding, it's becoming regularly larger. And you can see that even over the main sequence from 0 to 1, the radius is increasing with the main sequence age, even over the stellar main sequence. But then as you get to the main sequence turn off, this really kind of blows up. And yeah, we think this is because of the atmospheres being heated by the star's radiation. And yeah, you can see that, you know, I've made some kind of linear fit to this, but really it's a non-linear model that we should be fitting here. And people who are trying to find more of these hot Jupiters around evolved host stars, there's a bunch of papers that are coming out of this group that are trying to do this, and they do see that most of the hot Jupiters around these types of stars are much more inflated. And so, like, this is the kind of broad picture from this study, is that we see that they do inflate over the main sequence age, but we also see that the equilibrium radius of these hot Jupiters does depend on metallicity as well. And so there are other host star connections at play here. And one thing that I really want to try and figure out is, you know, whether there is an unmodeled mass dependence like lying inside this kind of analysis, because even if you think that you've removed the mass dependence by fitting a model beforehand, you know, age and main sequence age are intrinsically linked to the stellar mass, because more massive stars don't live as long in life. And so anytime you're looking at an age trend, you have to be careful. You might be looking at stellar mass trend. But luckily we have homogeneous stellar masses, so we can start to probe that too. And so that's the general picture, though, like, regardless of the exact mechanism that's causing this. Stellar flux is causing some kind of inflation that's related to the planet flux and the equilibrium temperature. And this is a result of stellar planet evolution. So this is a way that ages can tell us about evolution rather than just formation. And there's people thinking about this and working on this too. And as is the case with many exoplanet areas, what we really need is more observations of hot Jupiters around these evolved stars. And so I talked about hot Jupiters there, and I talked about some small rocky planets. But I haven't talked much about cold Jupiters, and I haven't talked about how we think hot Jupiters form. And, you know, the broad picture is that they evolve from cold Jupiters. So cold Jupiters will at some point migrate inwards. The exact migration mechanism is up for debate as well. They'll migrate inwards towards their host star. And, you know, using this data set that I already had, I thought, like, you know, can we try to think about whether the age distributions of these two populations of planets is different as well? And actually, there have been a few papers, as I was thinking about this, a few papers have come out that have tried to do some kind of statistical analysis of how old hot Jupiter host stars are versus cold Jupiter host stars. And here's just a simplified plot from one of these papers that came out in 2023 that kind of suggests that hot Jupiters are orbiting younger stars than cold Jupiters. So you can see the frequency on the y-axis and the age on the x-axis here. I've just labeled them to make them a bit more simple, but that's what the labels actually meant in the paper. The blue line is cold Jupiter occurrence as a function of age, and hot Jupiter is the red line. Now, they didn't have an enormous sample in this paper, but you can see there's a very distinct difference. And the idea is that, you know, cold Jupiters exist, and there's nothing really stopping them from continuing to exist if they're orbiting on these longer periods. But if a planet orbits inwards and becomes a hot Jupiter, it's much more likely to come to its untimely death a little bit earlier because it gets tidally disrupted, or there's you know, engulfment events or other such things that cause the planet to not exist anymore. There's a few other theories as to why we're observing this difference in age, but in general, that's the picture. And there's been a couple of other papers that have come out more recently as well that are kind of observing the same thing. And so I was interested to see if we see the same thing in our sample. And this is the plot I showed you right at the beginning, actually. It's just the mass and the period. But, you know, you can see, even just from color coding these stars with their age, that the cold Jupiter planets, host stars, which are in this right-hand plot, look like they are older on average than these hot Jupiter hosts. And so we're kind of seeing the same thing even when we're just applying this homogeneous methodology. But, you know, you might be looking at this and thinking about all of the huge biases that go into our observations of hot and cold Jupiters, and you'd be entirely correct to challenge a plot like this with that concept. And so I just wanted to, oh yeah, and also you can, as I said with the previous work, you know, you have to consider whether underlying this age trend is just a mass effect. You know, for some reason, are more massive stars more likely to host hot Jupiter, and then less massive stars more likely to host a cold Jupiter. Maybe the mass of the star affects migration in some way. You know, like you could plausibly argue that that's the case. It's hard to tell unless you do proper occurrence rate studies, and so I just wanted to highlight that Francesca Waynes, who's a PhD student at UCL, who I was working with a bit before I left, and still am a little bit, is planning to do a full occurrence rate study of this kind of thing. She's doing like full injection recovery tests using the whole tick sample. I can't remember which cadence she's using. And this is just a plot of radius and orbital period from her recent paper. So she wrote her first paper on homogenizing all the stellar parameters from the tick, which is a huge undertaking, and I just wanted to tell you about that. If you're interested in using them, I'm not sure if they're actually attached to the archive yet, but they will be soon. But in order to do this full occurrence rate study and figure out if it's a mass effect or an age effect when we're looking at the different distributions of host star parameters for hot Jupiters and cold Jupiters, you first have to treat all of your stars the same. And so that's what she's done. And hopefully the occurrence rate paper will be out later in the year too. So I don't have a good answer or like a wrap-up you know, conclusion for this science question, but I'm hoping Francesca will do it and give us an answer by the end of the PhD, which will be exciting. And so I just want to like briefly pause here and say that these are the two primary like takeaways that I want you to think about when you're thinking about, you know, broadly thinking about age in the exoplanet context over demographics. But, you know, those of you who are perhaps stellar, more stellar focused will look at this methodology and say, okay, it's homogeneous and it needed to be homogenized, but it's not easy to estimate the ages of main sequence stars, especially not, you know, the types of stars that we're looking at, which might be as cool as the sun, maybe some of them are a bit cooler. And you'd be correct, you know, like we've treated everything homogenously and we think we've been pretty conservative with our error bars, but that does mean there's a degree of like imprecision. And that's the case whenever you try to age a host star, unless you use more precise techniques. And so I want to spend the rest of this talk talking about how we can improve our understanding of the timescales using asteroseismology. This is where the second half of my title comes in. I didn't exclude it by mistake in the first, but I'll talk a little bit about asteroseismology and how we can use this to refine some of these processes and science questions that I just talked about. So this is a light curve of a star that is hosting some planets. Two of the transits are shown here. It actually has a third, but it's not in this range of data. And you can see the two transits here. This is planet B and planet D of this particular system. But I've also highlighted a bit of the light curve. So this is just, for those of you maybe who don't look at light curves, it's just time and then flux on the y-axis. And then I've highlighted a section of this in pink that's actually the stellar variability. So the bits of light curve in between the planet information that maybe many of us are interested in actually give us really, really interesting information about stars. And you know, like we always say, one person's noise is another person's data. And so we can use the non-interesting parts of these light curves to actually do some really cool science. And actually this is a light curve of a system called Mu-2 Lupi, which is a very bright host star that hosts 3 relatively small planets. It's very well studied. So I'm showing you this light curve, but I didn't find these planets. And I'm not claiming to. But what I want to tell you about is how we were able to use the stellar variability to redefine some of the system parameters and get a really precise age for the star. To do this, we used asteroseismology. So for those of you unfamiliar with asteroseismology, you're probably familiar with the term seismology, and this refers to measuring earthquakes, essentially. And we know that earthquakes are induced by convection in the mantle, which has this molten rock and these huge convective cycles that are eventually reaching the surface and causing you know, the plates on the surface to move about and to oscillate. And then we measure these oscillations on the surface of the Earth, and we're able to, you know, figure things out about the interior of the Earth because we're measuring the sound waves that are traveling through the Earth. Most people are pretty familiar with that. And essentially, asteroseismology, to a simplified degree, is performing the same science, but in stars. So stars, like the sun, just beneath their surface, have a convective zone where instead of mantle that's going through these upwelling and downwellings and these convective motions, there's extremely hot plasma. But it's following, you know, convective patterns in a similar way. And what that does is drive oscillations that, you know, propagate throughout the interior of the star and cause fluctuations in temperature on the surface that we can measure as surface brightness variations. And so what that means is we can measure that in that little slice of stellar variability that I showed you in the light curves. We can use that to measure these oscillations. And if we take a Fourier transform of a section of that light curve in the time domain and put it in the frequency domain, we can actually see these beautiful peaks that tell us about the timescales and therefore the frequencies of these particular oscillations that are probing the interior of the star. And you can see that this is kind of following a Gaussian shape. Now, Mu-2 Lupi is not the best signal-to-noise example of asteroseismology, but I wanted to show you the data that I actually worked on. It's actually in the paper. And nevertheless, you can see that it follows this Gaussian sort of shape in the area that we expect these oscillations to occur. And the frequency of maximum power, which is sort of the central frequency of this Gaussian, is related to the physical properties of the star, as is, you know, the spacing between the frequencies. So the spacing kind of between the different modes of oscillation in time and frequency can tell you about how quickly the waves are traveling in the interior of the star, and so that can tell us about the density inside the star. And because density is a pretty fundamental stellar parameter, what this can tell you about is the mass and the radius of the star. And using those precise masses and radii, we can really accurately define the age of the host star. Now, for those of you who are asteroseismologists, I think there's maybe a couple of you online. For this particular star, we were actually able to do individual frequency modeling, where we took positions of these individual frequencies and fitted it to more complex models than these equations that I'm showing you here to get even more precise with this. But the same physical principles still stand. And what happened when we did this is that we looked at a planet that Mu-2 Lupi has orbiting around it that's in this mass radius range for these small rocky planets that I showed you. And we were able to basically assign it a color-coded age, similar to the rest of these planets. This is an extremely old star. It's in the thick disk, and we measure a really old astroseismic age that agrees with some of its kinematics that put it into the thick disk. And what this means is when we plot it on this mass radius diagram, it actually lines up pretty well with what we would expect if we were to believe our galactic chemical evolution picture that we painted with the results of this first paper. And so this is, an unexpected but sort of pleasantly surprising outcome of this paper where we were trying to model the asteroseismology of this host star. And so, you can imagine if we were able to do this for multiple host stars in this sample of, when new planets are found, we're able to pin down the astroseismic ages really nicely. This can tell us about, maybe the formation histories of these types of planets. And this is the paper that this result is in. And yeah, like I said, if we can get more astroseismic ages, we can help refine formation mechanisms of these kinds of planets, which is really exciting. TESS has done this a little bit, but it's a little bit more challenging because TESS is such a small instrument. It's covering huge areas of the sky, which gives us great statistics, but unfortunately the precision needed to do this kind of astroseismology isn't there for all stars unless they're very bright. But luckily Plato is being launched at the end of this year, and it has this exact goal. It's 50-50. It's trying to do astroseismic ages and find small planets. And so what I'm really hoping, and I think many people are hoping it's going to find lots of small planets and get ages, but I'm hoping we'll be able to, populate specifically this area of mass radius space to try and disentangle whether our interpretation of this formation mechanism is actually correct. And if not, what else is happening? What other age trends can we think about when we're thinking about small exoplanets? So that's how we can use astroseismology as a tool. Other people have, applied astroseismology to larger samples of exoplanet host stars in the past, and it's helped them to refine different features of the demographics of exoplanets, like the radius valley or inflation or other processes like that. But right now we haven't got a huge new sample until we get Plato data. So very excited for that in the next couple of years as well. And I just want to briefly talk about how astroseismology and stellar properties can kind of link to our studies of atmospheres. Now, I'm not an expert in planet atmospheres, but I'm really excited by the data that we can get from James Webb. You've probably seen, if you're not a planet person, even you've probably seen lots of the really exciting JWST atmosphere results over the past few years that just give us this unprecedented photometric precision that we can use to measure the atmospheres of exoplanets. But what I've been thinking about and what I want to talk to you about now is how we can maybe look at the host stars of exoplanets using the same James Webb data. To do that, I'm going to explain briefly to you another process that can contribute to the stellar variability that we saw in that little pink slice of the light curve. I showed it to you from TESS, but light curve is a light curve. No matter which instrument you get it from, you're always going to be able to observe that variability if your noise is good enough. And another type of stellar noise that we can observe in these slices is noise from granulation. So granulation is powered by the same convective mechanisms that power astroseismic oscillations, but granulation actually is a result of convective flows reaching the surfaces of stars and causing this granule-like pattern on the surfaces of solar-like stars. So there's an upwelling and downwelling of plasma that reaches the surface, and these bright points in the centers of these granules, as we call them, are the hot plasma flowing up, and then the cool is the plasma, as it's called, falling back down. And the temperature contrast between these granules, obviously you can resolve it on a star like the sun, but for stars that are unresolved, we see this as a stochastic brightness variability. And the time scales of this variability actually scale with the size of the granules, which scales with the size of the star. And so it can tell us a bit about the stellar properties. It's not as precise as astroseismology in giving us stellar properties, but it can still tell us information about the star and what's going on the surface and what the surface gravity is like. And so I'm showing you here an example from a Kepler star. This again is frequency along the x-axis and then some proxy for power on the y-axis. If you're not familiar with these units, it doesn't matter. It's just telling you the power. And you can see the oscillations that I showed you, this beautiful Gaussian-like comb structure, and that's where nu max is, that parameter that I showed you. But if there was nothing else going on in this star and there was no other variability, then we'd expect the left-hand side of this plot to be a flat line, horizontal line. But actually what we have observed and what people were able to observe, for hundreds of thousands of stars with Kepler data is that there's this excess red correlated noise. People call it red noise, correlated noise. And this happens at some characteristic granulation frequency, which I've sort of labeled here. And this blue line is just smoothing over this data. And I'm going to show you now a similar diagram, but using some data from James Webb. And what we were trying to do with this was explore whether we could see this granulation signature in the James Webb data. Now, James Webb data is usually much shorter than this Kepler data. This is like 4 years of Kepler data. James Webb usually looks at planets for like 8 hours. We're looking at WASP-121, which was observed with NIRISS. I'm showing you the band passes of NIRISS, this is order 1 and order 2 here, that the time series observations that they were able to do. Order 2 is in the purple, and order 1 is in the yellow, and this just shows you the wavelengths that they were operating at. And just as a first look, we're looking at the integrated light from this yellow curve. And this is the frequency spectrum from this star using that integrated light. Now, I overplotted the Kepler curve here because this star, the KIC 913 phone number star, is extremely similar in its physical parameters to WASP-121. They're basically the same temperature, basically the same metallicity, basically the same log G. And so this is a really good litmus test to try and see if any signals that we're seeing in this WASP-121 star are actually physical signals that match what we expect from a similar physical star. And you can see that actually, it's relatively convincing that we're seeing granulation here. There's this slope in the low frequency end that's matching quite well with the Kepler data. But also remarkably, you might be able to convince yourself when you look at this plot that when we smooth over this data, and that's what I've done using the black line and the blue line, we see a moderate peak here, exactly where we'd expect to see oscillations in WASP-121, at the same point that we see it in the Kepler star. If this was in a different location that we wouldn't expect to see these frequencies in, it would be a bit more believable with its noise. But this is a relatively convincing evidence of seeing oscillations and granulation in the infrared, which hasn't been observed before. And I'm just going to zoom in on that oscillation bump to show you a similar frequency diagram that I showed you from Nu-2 Loopy. The Nu-2 Loopy data also spanned a lot more, a longer time scale. This was only like 37 hours of data, but because the cadence of these James Webb observations is like 6 seconds, we're able to extract even some individual frequency peaks here in black, which shows the James Webb data. So this is really exciting. And then, we were able to use Asteroseismology to measure the nu max of this star. We've got an estimate for the delta nu, but it's a little bit harder to measure it just because of the quality of the data. But we're relatively certain that, using this NIRISS source data, which was given to us by our collaborators in Toronto, had the planet transit removed, we detected oscillations and granulation in this James Webb star at near-infrared wavelengths for the first time. This is still a little bit of a work in progress, so it's not submitted yet, but we're at the point where we believe this pretty strongly, and we think this is the first detection. But after we characterized these oscillations, we wanted to make sure that they were at amplitudes that we would expect, and so this is just plotting the amplitudes as a function of nu max for WASP-121 in the which is shown by the star in this plot, and the Kepler star, which is shown by the triangle in this star. And then this is a bunch of data from a paper by Mariam Saeed, which studied oscillations in similar Kepler stars for like 700 stars. And we see that for the temperature and the nu max, the amplitudes are as expected, which kind of verifies our detection here. But we can take this one step further for the granulation, because granulation has much higher amplitudes. It's a stronger signal than oscillations. So we expect power to be higher. And so what we were able to do is actually split up the data into the individual spectral light curves, just like people do when they're trying to study exoplanet atmospheres. So in the original paper by Jared Splinter, they split up the data into these 8 bins, and they measured the planet transit depths at each of these bins, and they measured the phase curve, and they were able to use that to do an atmospheric retrieval to measure the atmosphere based on the wavelength-dependent transit depth. But what we wanted to do is use these individual wavelength bins to try and measure the amplitude of the granulation in each of these wavelength bins to see if it's different at different wavelengths. we haven't had data that's simultaneously observing in different wavelengths previously that has enabled us to do this. So it just hasn't been possible. We've been able to maybe compare Kepler to TESS, which is slightly different wavelengths, but it wasn't really doable before James Webb. And here I'm showing you the predicted bolometric ratio for like the ratio of the amplitude of a visible light observation, which would be the leftmost point here, and then showing you how that would change with wavelength if you made some relatively simple bolometric assumptions about your observations. And over this, I'm going to show you the observations that we made. So we measured the amplitude of the granulation signal at each of those wavelengths and showing you the ratio of those amplitudes with respect to the bluest bin as well. And this is just a simplified way so that we can compare the observations and the data. The observations and the models. And here in the stars, I'm showing you the observations that we make. It doesn't fit exactly with this functional form of the bolometric predictions, but what we can observe is that there is a decrease in amplitude of the granulation signals with wavelengths with this data. Now, comparing exactly to lots of different models and trying to fit a functional form would probably be pushing the James Webb data a little bit too far, because we only have a day and a half of data, and these two redder wavelength bins in NIRISS are pretty noise dominated, and so they should be taken with some caution. But nevertheless, the overall trend is that granulation is a chromatic process, as predicted by theory for many years. We just weren't able to observe it, apart from in the sun, at sort of far, like the edges of the visible wavelengths. And so this is kind of the summary of what we do with the granulation here. And because the amplitude of the granulation signal decreases with wavelength, it's very important that the granulation modulation in the light curve be measured and modeled correctly in each wavelength bin. If you're trying to measure transit depth in each wavelength bin, because if you don't include these chromatic effects in your modeling, you might be systematically biasing your transit depths, which will systematically bias your measurements of the atmospheres of these planets with James Webb data. This isn't as big of a problem for very cool stars because granulation is not nearly as strong on their surfaces and the granules are much smaller. But for a G or an F-type star, this is an F-type star, a relatively hot F-type star, it's clear that this is a consideration that people should really take when they're modeling stellar atmospheres and feeding those into exoplanet atmosphere models. So this is the paper that we're going to submit hopefully soon, and this is the main message. But I'll wrap everything up by giving you my final conclusions here. So the top two are kind of how I talked about how ages are really important to understand. On the left-hand side, formation, and then on the right-hand side, evolution of planetary systems. And really, the only way of better understanding exactly how those processes are affected is by getting more precise ages. And one of the best ways to do that is using asteroseismology, which we can do with Kepler and TESS. But now, I think what we found is we can do it with James Webb too, and try and better understand our atmosphere models by doing that. And I'll leave it there and happy to have questions. Thank you very much.